In a moment when culture itself feels under siege, museums and artists are confronting new forms of pressure. Across the country, exhibitions are being challenged, books removed from shelves, and creative expression politicized. What does it mean to create, to curate, and to keep showing work when institutions are under fire? And how does the art world hold its ground to remain a space for reflection, dialogue, and imagination? These are some of the questions we'll explore on Edge of Reason. A limited series podcast produced by Atlantic Rethink, the Atlantic's creative marketing studio, in partnership with Hauser Wirth, a home to visionary modern and contemporary artists. In this episode, we bring you a roundtable moderated by Alexis Lowry, Curatorial Senior Director at Hauser Wirth. Let's join the conversation.
Today I'm joined by Hamza Walker, Director of the Brick in Los Angeles, and Henriette Huldisch, Chief Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. Hamza's current exhibition, Monuments, which he organized with artist Kara Walker and MOCA Senior Curator Bennett Simpson, is currently on view at the Brick and the Geffen Contemporary at MOCA. It brings together decommissioned Confederate monuments and new contemporary works of art to look closely at how history and memory function in public space. It is one of the most consequential exhibitions of this century. Henriette joined the Walker as chief curator in January 2020 and has guided a transformation in the museum's curatorial approach, from thoughtfully rehanging the permanent collection to attentively expanding in-gallery resources. She's focused on how the public encounters works of art. At the Walker, Henriette's work examines how art shapes and is shaped by questions of power, visibility, and meaning, supporting artists who expand the language of contemporary practice across disciplines and the publics who engage them. Together, we'll talk about making and presenting art within a charged cultural landscape and how creative work continues to evolve within shifting social and political conditions. So, I wanted to begin by asking you both a kind of general question. As curators, both of you work with artists who engage difficult or contested ideas. How do you think about creating space for complexity, contradiction, and multiple viewpoints within an exhibition program? Henriette, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, thanks, Alexis, first for that intro. We try to be responsive to our audiences. And one of the things that we are hearing from visitors, from community members, is really that people want us to present things that are thoughtful, that are sometimes challenging, that people want us to platform underrepresented voices and narratives. So I think there is a way in which we're meeting what the audience expects from a museum or an art center. I do think in terms of making exhibitions matter or understood that might be difficult or challenging, there are sort of basic curatorial things that you need to do. It is a way of putting things together in space that people can have some sort of visual experience from, make meaning from. But I think also a lot of it has to do with how we frame the very things that we're presenting, the language that you're using around exhibitions. And I think there is a way in speaking in plain, accessible language about difficult concepts that helps people along. The other thing I will say is that I think sort of about a balance between what people are encountering. So there's a way in which the overall balance of shows and types of works and types of artists and the types of issues and topics you present can help towards that.
Yes. Sometimes you want to generate counterpoint. In other cases, you want to double down. In some cases, it's a puzzle, right? And then how do the pieces fit together? What do you have to shuffle around and why? So in some cases, it might be as simple as cost in terms of what are the requirements of an exhibition. And if you put two back to back that require a radically different build out, you don't want to do that. If you can use the same layout for one exhibition for another one, then that would make sense. So those kinds of considerations. But in terms of what's the shape of a program over the course of 1 or 2 years. And what does that look like? What does that feel like? How does that respond to a given moment, set of themes, a set of issues? That's always fun to try to give it shape, I guess I should say.
When you think about this particular cultural moment, what do you see as the core function of a public institution, an art museum or an exhibition space right now?
I guess I would say what we do is inherently public, right? Making exhibitions, presenting them to an audience, working with artists to realize projects and exhibitions. Certain exhibitions might require risk. That's another aspect of things. And how much risk can you run? That can vary greatly from one institution to the next. I mean, I would say we can incur and take on kinds of risks that the Walker or MOCA couldn't take on.
I agree with Hamza. I think it depends a lot on the size of your institution, your location, your mission, actually, how you sculpt the programming. I would say, though, in this particular moment, more than previous points in my career, I've been thinking a lot about our mission and our responsibility as civic and educational institutions, and a responsibility that we feel at a moment when educational institutions are under duress, when there's very little art education in public schools in many places. And I do think that there is a very critical civic role, and one that I think is, in a way, has filled me with a renewed sense of purpose about what art can teach about ambiguity, about complexity, about the fact that you can hold two different perspectives and meanings to be true at the same time, that you can encounter something that you find difficult or maybe uncomfortable, but you can move through it and learn from that. And those are things that maybe you can call soft skills, but they're also really civilizing tools and really critical tools that I think couldn't be more consequential than ever, really.
Hamza, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Monument Show and how it came about.
So the idea for the exhibition started in the fall of 2017, and that was after the events of Charlottesville and the Unite the Right rally. And the reaction by counter-protesters across the country was the removal of roughly a couple dozen monuments came down. And so together with the monuments that had come down in New Orleans was the first municipality to remove their monuments. And that was in response to the 2015 Mother Emanuel Church Massacre in Charleston, South Carolina. That was the catalyst for the call to take signs and symbols of the Confederacy down, which then prompted the mayors of different towns to take them down because of public safety concerns. Either protesters are going to take them down or white supremacists are going to rally around them. So that first wave of removals is what prompted the idea for monuments. And now I was drawn to the significance because it, as a response to the Mother Emanuel Church Massacre, that event was significant because it called into question the progress in the wake of the civil rights movement. That shooting brought to mind the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. A tragedy and an event that many years after the civil rights movement, people weren't thinking was possible. So the significance of the monuments coming down as it was connected to that set of questions, that's what drew me to what was important about it, right? And so the idea was very simple. What about trying to borrow some of these monuments and showing them alongside works of contemporary art? So it's a very straightforward premise.
But one of the things that I think is really radical about the MOCA installation is essentially you've taken the pedestals away, you've put them directly on the ground next to these artworks, but you've also treated the works the way you would any other artwork in your wall text. And you call out the artists who made these objects. You kind of take away the mythology of them speaking for the state.
Yeah. Writing about the monuments in terms of, just the facts, ma'am. Like, who does this depict? What are they remembered for? That actually tempered, I would say, how we approach the didactics for everything, which is very, very interesting. And I think because so many of the works of contemporary art are commissions, so we didn't know what we were going to get. So we dealt with the monuments first. So the monuments kind of took the lead, and then having to write and address those works in that fashion then tempered how we actually approached writing about the contemporary work.
I think it does something really powerful. It does a huge amount of work in the exhibition for how you experience the history, but also like not disempower it in some way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. To bring them inside of a museum is completely different than how we would engage a monument or a memorial outdoors, right? Which is speaking more at us. It's not necessarily the object of a certain kind of reflection, let's say. So then when you put it indoors, let alone with works of contemporary art, where I would say you're predisposed towards not simply getting information and learning about something, but also asking questions where the questions are as important, let's say, as any kind of conclusions that you're drawing from encountering these objects. It isn't just the labels themselves, it's how we're looking at the things.
I mean, just having seen these images of how you have literally kicked off their pedestal sculptures in the spaces, it's so incredible and kind of disconcerting and unusual, and sort of makes you realize, I think, how these monuments in public spaces, in a park or in the middle of a town square, or wherever they might be, or in front of a courthouse, they sort of represent this unspoken authority and certain claims towards eternity, but they also become completely invisible. Like, a lot of people don't really pay much attention to those figures at all. Whereas what you've done in the show, you make them, both sort of humble them literally, but also make them hyper visible. And it's such an interesting tension in encountering these works that you never see that way in that context.
Yeah, exactly. You hit the nail right on the head. That it's a very fine line, but a very powerful one to realize, when we talk about monuments, we talk about them categorically, but we actually don't look at them. Like, who was this and what is going on with them? So that was the first order of business. It's like, no, let's take this thing down off the pedestal and bring it over. So what that does, even at a phenomenological level, in terms of, one, bringing them indoors, let alone be on the same ground plane with you, radically, in terms of the scale, they suddenly acquire a scale that they don't have outdoors. So, Henriette, what you're saying, that all worked in concert to then, even before interpretation, right? Just the conditions, the framework at that literal level was very, very important to even begin in terms of meaning making, right? So it's like, what are the sub-basements to the arts experience here? And those were really, really important.
Henriette, you work at a place that obviously has galleries, indoors, traditional museum spaces, but you also have a public park, essentially, that you program in. Do you think about the different registers that things will be read through when you are thinking about what will be where? How does being indoors versus outdoors change how you guys think about what you're presenting?
Yeah. The Minneapolis Sculpture Garden was started in 1988, so it's a contemporary type of sculpture garden, and the sculptures are not older than the second half of the 20th century. A lot of them were commissioned for the outside or made with an eye towards that. So I think in some ways, even though you are in a public park, we transpose some of the viewing conventions from the gallery outdoors a little bit. But then, of course, they do something completely different in that space too. And I'm thinking about, we have the large Katharina Fridge Hancock, which started as a Trafalgar Square pedestal commission, which of course is a huge blue rooster on a very big base, and which is a whimsical, funny take on the idea of having these large authoritative figures in public spaces. But then, of course, there are also a lot of works that were made at a time or, over the course of this 20th century, sculpture shown in museums and galleries kind of dispenses with that function of representing political authority, religious narratives, mythologies, or ideas of beauty. So a lot of these works were already made for a different type of viewership and viewing conventions.
So exhibitions often develop over many years. The seeds of the idea for monuments began in 2017. Hamza, how do you navigate shifts in the cultural context or landscape between the initial planning of a project and the moment when a show finally opens to the public?
Sure. Well, over the 8-year period of working on the project, the first shift, even though the premise stayed the same, the activism surrounding monuments and the activism surrounding those high-profile police shootings of Blacks and Black Lives Matter, those were two separate lanes. And it was the murder of George Floyd where the dam broke. And the question about the relationship between present-day grievances and historical injustices was really clear. And so that just broadened the scope of issues that the show could address, the number of topics. At the same time, an additional 150 monuments came down. So that just gave the show greater breadth and greater depth. So then continuing through to January 6th of 21, right? And then you can keep going forward, the attack on critical race theory. So it suddenly things started to just like were unfolding in real time as we were doing the exhibition, which was great in terms of a certain kind of dynamism. This is all before the election of 2024. So in no way was the show, even though the events were unfolding in real time over those 8 years, by the time we got nearer to the election of 2024, the show had a life of its own. We knew that it was going to open in 25, at which point it would be the 10-year anniversary of the shooting in Charleston. So the show had its own legs and a life of its own, and is not at all a referendum on the current moment. But then how could it not be, in some sense, when I'd mentioned it being connected to a larger arc or narrative that is simply American history, right? And to understand perhaps that, you know, when people want to talk about it in relationship to this moment, to try to understand it as, in some sense, reactionary, right, to that larger arc or a vision of what we want this country to be, you know, at the end of the day, right? And then there are challenges to and reactions to what that vision is, particularly in the wake of the civil rights movement.
I was thinking about that a lot too, Hamza. I think we talked about the show at a certain point in 2022, which obviously still came out of 2020 and that cataclysmic moment where there was like a broad public sentiment that the monuments shouldn't be in public spaces, sort of like a really broad social cultural recognition of systemic injustices and how issues of representation in museums are contributing to those. And now a really fierce backlash from conservative quarters. And I think your show is really interesting in being one that would have been incredibly trenchant 5 years ago too, but in a very different way. Maybe it's a more important show now that it opened in 2025 rather than in 2022. But I guess one of the things I've been thinking about, like, it really didn't take that much redressing in museums or addressing representational politics for this kind of backlash to be upon us, you know?
Yeah.
So I want to take a step back and think about Kara Walker's sculpture Unmanned Drone, which consists of a Confederate statue of Stonewall Jackson that has been completely transformed into something almost unrecognizable. I wanted to ask what the past can teach us about resilience and the idea of creative freedom in difficult times, and how you both approach that in your work.
Well, working with Kara on this project has been wonderful. And the issue of what are we asking of artwork? What is its capacity? What is its potential? But to actually work with an artist and to see her realize a piece that lives up to all of that rhetoric and then some, insofar as the bounds of a certain kind of speech, and when is that the bounds of that speech need to be broken. Again, under what conditions and what circumstances, and what are some of the things that need to be said that might be outside the bounds of polite speech, let's say, or even to some extent what would constitute civil discourse. I was asked to summarize the piece, which shocked me because it's a piece that has so many layers and facets to it. And I said, oh, well, actually, it's quite easy. It's a very elegant fuck you. And what does it mean for a work to say no? All caps, exclamation point. In the face of the rhetoric of the lost cause as it gets reconjured and reconjured every time you want to talk about why these things should not be in public spaces. That this is our history, right? That these were brave, good Christian men. The ability to try and to engage in that kind of rhetoric and to fail repeatedly in terms of trying to be heard. And so what recourse does one have and what kind of speech is necessary to cut through that, to get someone's attention in order to further the discourse and dialogue so that one can be heard, and to look to art to have to do that. And that can be a risky proposition, but that's what I want to believe that museums and galleries can do, right, is to present these works and to have a space for that kind of speech to be considered and heard and understood at the level of urgency and the volume at which it needs to operate. And in another way, the question of whether or not Kara's piece involved the destruction of an existing work of art for this one. And I feel as though I put those two things together, that yes, those ethical concerns are perfectly valid. But again, when I say it's an elegant fuck you, that also extends to, yes, this very well may have involved the destruction of an existing work in order to make a work that functions to be heard about what that work was doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question for two people who are working in a contemporary field, because sometimes we present works that sort of make a proposition for the future, and we don't know how people are going to look at the work in 50, let alone 100 years from now. But I do think we are playing the long game as institutions, right? We are presenting works and we're putting them in context for a particular reason, because sometimes we think they're addressing really critical issues of the day. And I think if you do look back in history, you see obviously a lot of instances where we don't get it right, or where maybe a certain kind of work is in vogue that falls out of favor or really doesn't age well. But then there are also a lot of times in which we do get something right. But artists always speak eloquently to and about the things that are happening at any given moment in time. And the way we as institution frame that can help clarify that, can help bring that to different audience, can also sometimes bring an artist's voice that has been completely forgotten out and show how it's incredibly relevant to what people are thinking and feeling now or at any given point. One of the things that when Hamza was talking about, is sort of a takeaway, if you see things in a museum, or if somebody comes to a museum and sees historical works and some that have been made under periods of political oppression, and how these works have been preserved and worked through, is that yes, maybe there's an understanding that history is cyclical rather than linear, but also that things never go back to the way they were before, even though some people might hope that, but it simply doesn't happen that way.
Hamza, Henriette, I want to just thank you both so much for your insight and your time, and for talking to us about what it means to make exhibitions and present artworks at this moment. So thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Monuments is on view at the Brick and the Geffen Contemporary at MOCA in Los Angeles through May 3rd, 2026.
To close this third season of Edge of Reason, let's reflect on the ideas that have guided our journey. Metamorphosis, inner worlds, time embodied, resistance, an artist's legacy, and the pool of myth and memory. Our guests have explored their unique visions of the world, how artists draw from the past to question the present, how they reimagine stories we inherit, how they transform memory into something that reverberates through to today. What we've discovered is that art transforms, lingers, unsettles, and connects, reminding us that history is never fixed, but alive in the questions we continue to ask. I'm Jeff Chang. Thank you for joining us on Edge of Reason. If you've enjoyed what you've just heard, like and review us on Apple Podcasts and help spread the word about our series to other listeners like you.